Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the RightFax technical training webinar. My name is Jeff Kunstler and I will be conducting the training. Due to the overwhelming turnout, all participants will be muted. Please hold all questions to the end of the webinar and email them to training@atechnologies.com and we will answer all questions as soon as possible. Before we begin, I did want to mention that although this training is not an advanced class, I'm going to assume that everyone knows how to use the basic functionality of the RightFax fax utility. So I'm going to skip over how to send and receive faxes and other basic tasks and get right into more advanced functionality. I'm going to get right into it and we're going to start going through the RightFax fax utility. Obviously, everyone's familiar with this utility. It's the basic utility used for sending and receiving faxes. I'm going to go into some of the more, I'll say, advanced features we have, and I'll hopefully give you a little tutorial on that. So we're going to start by going right into the fax utility, which you can see on the screen. If I click on Tools, we're going to go right into Options. Some of the things under the Tools options you could do that I think are pretty neat are, on the receiving, you could actually take any fax that comes in and forward to a user or forward to a new number. So when I say forward receive faxes to a user, I mean forwarding it to a RightFax user. And in this field, you actually put your RightFax user ID that you want to transfer to, or you can drop down, as you can see, and fill it in right here. You also have the ability to automatically print any received faxes. Now the key to this feature is the printer needs to already be installed on the RightFax system, not the server, but the system, and we're going to go into that when we do the Enterprise Fax Manager. And the last thing is automatic OCR. If you are licensed for that function, you have the ability to create a text document out of any inbound fax that comes in. So we'll go on to the notification. Some of the interesting things under the notification tab are the activate alternate user notification. What we can have is a fax can come in, and even though you're getting the fax, we can actually send an email to another user that a fax has arrived in your fax box. That's good maybe if you're monitoring someone else's faxes through email and you just want to get the email when a fax comes into them. Some of the things here under the user information, if your administrators pulled you into the system and maybe didn't spell your name right, or you want to change it on the cover sheet, you have the ability to do it here. And under other options, you have some abilities to change the trash settings, change your notifications, how you want, if you want a notification on startup, open additional phone books. If users give you the ability, they need to have you on their security list, you can drop down and open up their phone number, their phone book. And if there's a password, obviously you'd have to put the password here. Hopefully you're all familiar with the RightFax Enterprise Fax Manager, and obviously this is where we do our administration for users and groups. So let's go right into the user section. Let's see what we got. Let me authenticate first with a user. And let's go right into the interface. So I'm going to pick a user. Let's go into this user here, and this message comes up when a user is imported or in sync with an outside application. In this case, we are using Active Directory synchronization. So it's warning me that if I change anything, there's a good possibility that it's going to get overwritten from the Active Directory or Kappa sync module. Now remember, that doesn't mean I can't edit this user. It just means to be careful because certain fields are mapped to Active Directory attributes. Example of that would be email address. If I change the email address here, next time it does a synchronization with Active Directory, it'll change to whatever information is in Active Directory. But there are certain features that are not in Active Directory that Active Directory has no idea about, such as permissions. So I can easily add or delete a permission from here and not have to worry about it getting overwritten from Active Directory. So if I wanted to give this user the ability to run reports, I can check it and everything will be fine. I don't have to worry at all. Other things I have to look at are the inbound routing. This one you have to be very careful because most of the fields here are going to be overwritten from Active Directory, such as the route code, which corresponds to the fax number field in Active Directory, and basically the default is to take the last 4 digits of the information in the fax number field in AD and put it here. The route type, again, although it's not in Active Directory, it is in the XSL file used to configure the configuration. So if I change it here, it will actually go back to Exchange. Same thing with file format, same thing with the route info, which in our case, since we're running Exchange 2003, has a distinguished name. If I overwrote this and put an email address, it would get overwritten back to a DN. Let's look at some of the other tabs that are important. Default outbound settings. This is where we have most of the information for the cover sheet. As you can see, this is all our outbound cover sheet information. And the other things here are your resolution, priority, pretty basic stuff. Default receive settings is a pretty nice one. Here's where we can actually decide what we want to do when we get a fax. In other words, do we want to print it? We can auto print it. And obviously, RightFax has to know about the printer. I don't know if we have any. Oh, we do. Good. So we have a couple of printers here. So if a fax comes into this fax box, it'll automatically be printed on this HP on our network, this HP 3005. We can also forward. Pretty straightforward. We can forward to a network user, and this has to be the ID, the RightFax ID, that is in this first field here. You can have, I forgot the limit, but at least 5 or more users here separated by commas. We can also forward to a fax machine, and here's where we would put a fax number. So this is what's also known as follow me faxing. So a fax can come in, and then if this is enabled, it'll automatically send another fax outbound to this destination. So if you were at a hotel or traveling somewhere, you can get the fax number there, put it in this field, and your fax would follow you to wherever you are. A couple other interesting features within the user configuration is the notification, which is pretty straightforward. Again, we have our method, which could be Exchange, SMTP. We have to put our address, and then we decide when we want to be notified. Do we want to be notified on successes, on complete failures, on failures that will be retried? As you notice here, the notification when initially received is not checked because we are actually receiving the fax within our email. So you have to be careful on this. A lot of customers do have this checked, and what happens is their end users will receive 2 copies. One will be the fax, which is under the inbound routing tab, because they're going to get a fax here, as you can see, a PDF. Then they'll also get a notification that they received a fax. So you probably don't want this checked if you're delivering faxes within your email. Some other things that you might want to look at under Other is the automatic fax list updates. This is just when you're using FaxUtil. This will update your faxes in FaxUtil in 60 seconds. So without this, or if this was set to a higher number, you'd have to hit that green refresh button in FaxUtil more often. You don't want to set this too low because it'll cause a little bit of some network traffic that you probably don't want. So I think 60 seconds is probably about right. Any other tabs of interest here we want to look at? Probably not. Pager notifications not used much anymore. Anything else? Administrative pages, same thing. It's basically the ability to page, alphanumeric pager when there's certain things going on with your RightFax server. Low disk space, some dock transport errors. So most of my customers don't have this set up, but if you're really interested in it, it's something that can be configured. We are now going to move on to RightFax groups. Groups in RightFax are pretty straightforward. Let's go right into one, which is Group Everyone, which is the group that's supplied with the default installation of RightFax. And by default, everyone is in Group Everyone. As you can see, there are 2 fields for an administrator and an alternate administrator. These are group administrators, not RightFax administrators. And what that means is any user account that is put in either of these 2 fields, either administrator or alternate administrator, becomes the administrator just for that group. So they can do certain things within that group. So if they run fax utility, they'll be able to view other users and other users' faxes that are in their group. And they do have a limited abilities to run the Enterprise Fax Manager and see just the users in their group and do some configuration within their own group. What they don't have the ability to do is create additional groups to stop and start services, to do other high-level administrative functions like dialing rules and things like that. Let's go back to the groups and take a look at some other things we have. The important one I find is the cover sheet model. I like to assign this on a group level and then set up my groups within the RightFax users. So basically, what I would do is I would define groups such as IT, accounting, and then what I would do is assign the document. When I say document, I mean the cover sheet model document that I want to assign to that group. This way, as users are added, they'll automatically get the proper cover sheet paste to the group that they're added to. So if they're in IT and for some reason the IT group has a different cover sheet, once I move them to the IT group, they would get that cover sheet. Notification type, again, same thing. It makes it easy to group a bunch of users that might want a different type of notification. For example, if you have a bunch of users that maybe use RightFax but don't have email accounts, you can set them up in that group. Maybe the group's called no email, and we could set their email to just network broadcast or SMTP instead of Exchange. So you have a little bit of control over here on your notifications. For users that have the enterprise level of RightFax, they should have this automatic fax aging button. Again, a pretty important one here. This is used to auto-delete. Don't be confused with auto-archive. These are deletes. So if you set this up and you define this as 30 days for all these folders, every fax that's older than 30 days is going to be deleted. Now, this deletion will occur 2 a.m. by default. That's the default maintenance window for RightFax. That can be adjusted from the server module, but the default will be 2 a.m. So once you define the aging here, when RightFax does its maintenance, it'll then delete faxes. And this is important because you don't want to treat RightFax as a doc management system. It's really not. You want to control how long you want to keep your faxes. If you don't have the enterprise version, you have the business version, there is a command line utility called FaxAge, which you can find under the admin utilities, and you can schedule that using the Windows scheduler to auto-delete faxes, and it's similar, but just not as easy to run as the GUI. You can basically set it daily to run. I would run it in the middle of the night, and there's switches, command line switches you can add to define how long you want to keep faxes for. It's not as granular as the GUI where you can actually define it on a folder level. As you can see here, you can see sent, outbound, so the different folders, and not only that, but viewed or unviewed. With the FaxAge command line utility, it does it on all the folders, so it's not as granular. For scheduling, very rarely used. If you enable it, basically what you're saying is anyone in this group can only send this many pages during these periods. And fax dialog customization, it's a pretty neat feature, not used much, but can be used to control how much your users can see when they run fax utility. So in other words, you can tighten up fax utility so certain fields don't even show up when they run it. You can turn off the billing information, alternate, you can turn off anything you want. Basically, you can define fax utility, so there's really not much to it but a field to put in a fax number and maybe an attachment, hit send. It's up to you. And that's your fax dialog. And the last one would be smart fax distribution, which is used if you had a group of users that maybe were running a fax desk, almost like an operators group where all the faxes that come in would come to them and you want to distribute it evenly amongst them. You would enable it, assign a route code, and then how do you want to distribute it? You could do linear or balanced. Linear just means first user A gets it, the next fax goes to user B. Balanced is a little different. It's based on how quick the users are processing a fax. So if user A has 3 faxes waiting in its fax box and hasn't viewed any of them and done anything with them, it'll send more to user B that might only have 1. It tries to even out the load. And this member refuse allow just allows a user who's maybe monitoring this fax queue to actually check a button when he goes out, maybe to lunch or when he's done, to refuse him from the group. So that person will not get the fax. So if there are 3 people in this group and that third person did not want to get the faxes, and you check this, they're allowed to excuse themselves from the group. Okay, now that we went over users and groups within Enterprise Fax Manager, I'd like to go through some of the important configurations you'll find under the Enterprise Fax Manager. So let's work our way down and start with signatures. Signatures in RightFax basically are used for outbound faxes that were sent from an application such as Word, where you can add the signature embedded code to. The way it works is you would sign your name on a nice clean sheet of paper, fax it into yourself, and then you can use the selection tool to put a box around your signature and store it as a signature. When you do that, you need to give it an ID, something descriptive, usually your name, and then when you want to use that signature on a document, you would put the embedded code signature right where you want the signature. So the format would be the less than bracket, the word signature, colon, your signature code, and then greater than. And RightFax would actually substitute that for your signature. Forms very similar. It's overlay, but the way you work it is very similar, where you would actually get the form that you want, fax it in, and then from Fax Utility, you can actually store it as a form. And I can actually show you that. I'll run the Fax Utility. And when you do new fax, under more options, you have use form. Now anything that you faxed in and stored as a form will show up on this list. Next section would be library documents. Very similar, where you take a document that you want, you fax it in, and using the Fax Utility, you store it as a library document. So if I go into an inbound document, I can actually go here and I can go fax, store as a form or library. Now when I store a library document, it's a little different. As I mentioned earlier, a form is an overlay. A library document is more of a attachment. And how you would use it or why you would use it is if you had a certain attachment that you fax often or you wanted other people to have access to, you can store it in a library, and then when someone sends an outbound fax, they can easily get to it. It's pre-formatted and pre-converted and ready to go. So it's a lot easier than browsing for your attachment, which you can do, and then clicking the attach button. At that point, it would be converted and sent as an attachment. A library document's already converted and there is no browse necessary. As you saw when I ran Fax Util, let me bring that up again. If I go to new fax and attachment, it's already there. My library documents are right here. I only have two, the sample that comes with RightFax and one called W9. But as you see, it's ready to go in 2 clicks, and I hit send, and that document is now attached. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to minimize this, and let's go back to the Enterprise Fax Manager. I skipped over printers and billing codes. Printers, pretty self-explanatory. Any printers that are known by RightFax here can be used for auto printing, not to be confused with workstation or client-side printing, which basically is any printer that is on your desktop you can print, obviously. So if you're in Fax Utility and you want to print a fax, any printer that you can print to, you can print a fax. When you have server-based printers, it's more for automatic printing. So if earlier when I showed under the users, there was a setting for receive settings, I'm pretty sure it was under, and it was auto printing. This is where you can set up these printers to auto print. So it's important that RightFax knows about the printers if you want to auto print. Billing codes have more purpose than it actually looks. Billing code in general is billing codes. You can actually, when you send a fax, add billing codes and run reports on them so you can get cost recovery. A lot of law firms use that. So when they send a fax, they can then run a report on a what they call client matter or billing code, and then bill back a customer. But what's nice about billing codes is they can be labeled. It's one of the only 2 fields in RightFax, if I bring up the Fax Utility, that you can actually relabel. And let me show you what I mean. If I go into Fax Utility and I go into my accounting section, you notice here it says reference 1 and 2. If I close out of Fax Utility and I go back to my billing codes here, you notice it also says reference 1 and 2. But if I go up to Utility and I go up to Customize Cover Sheet fields and I go to billing codes, I can change that to anything I want. I can have it, if I was a medical organization and I wanted to have the doctor's name, I can put doctor's name. Say OK. Now, if I open and close Enterprise Fax Manager and Fax Utility, you will see that my labels have changed on the fly. So I run that, and there it is, doctor's name. So now I can have my doctor's name here, and not only that, it shows up along the top. So you could run your filters, and you could search on doctor's name. So you could right-click and do a filter and look for Dr. Jones. There's only one doctor, so that's the only one that's going to come up. Oh, there should be a space there. Sorry about that. And boom, I filtered on that. So you can see it could become pretty powerful and limited. Basically, you can use RightFax as a limited doc management system to actually find data and put your own custom metadata fields based on these two, what we call billing codes 1 and 2, or what RightFax calls billing codes 1 and 2. Just by relabeling and renaming, we can actually do some searches. I will not forget to clear my filter, or else I'll have some trouble later. But that is basically how we use our billing codes and to relabel billing codes. We fire up Enterprise Fax Manager again. Oops, it's right here. We're going to move on to alerts and monitors. So I'm going to go through this real quick. Okay, and alerts and monitors can be used on a limited basis to monitor the RightFax system. You can set up new alerts and monitors. I'll do a test one here. We'll call it, I don't know, doc transport. We'll monitor the doc transport. Call it doc T, description, doc T. Category, which should be the doc transports. I like to do, well, they call it board servers, but we all know now it's doc transports. And the one I like to monitor is the send queue depth. So I would like to say if the send queue depth is greater than a certain number, let's say 50. So if I have 50 faxes waiting to go out, I probably have a problem and I want to be alerted. So I can then customize a message, say doc transport queue, QUE is greater than 50. Go back to my action. I'm going to create a new action, which will be email. And drop down to SMTP. I'll send it to myself. From RightFax. And we're ready to go. Let's take a look. So there's my message, and we are monitoring the doc transport. Let's take a look. Okay, so we're green because we're not greater than 50. If the doc transport queue was greater than 50, it currently has 1, we would get an email, or I would get an email. So the alerts and monitors are pretty neat. You can set them up as needed, and you can right-click and go through them all. There's a bunch. And just drop your category down, and then drop your statistic to monitor under the category. As you can see, they change based on the category. Some are only for monitoring, and some are more for alerting, or both. In this case, this is both. We're monitoring and alerting. Our queues here are just counters. Kind of neat. It could tell you how many documents your fax server has sent, what's going on in real time as far as conversions and PCL5 events and email events. And lastly, we're going to talk about dialing rules. Dialing rules, very powerful. I had customers take down an entire system with the wrong dialing rule. Pretty popular one is the first one. It says Jeff did this one. Basically, let's take a look at it. We have 10 question marks here. A question mark matches 1 digit. So what we're saying here is if someone dials 10 digits, and it applies to all faxes, high priority, normal, low, all traffic, it's no restrictions, which means that we're going to do it on all our servers, all our users, all our groups, and we're going to prepend a 1, which means that if someone dials 10 digits in the New York area, there is no such thing as 10-digit dialing, so we automatically add a 1 to make it 11 digits. It just protects the users when they forget to add a 1. And other things, pretty self-explanatory. We're going to do it time of day. All that means always. It's always, that rule always in effect. And we're not doing special actions like sending it on a specific range of channels or delaying it. But you could see, based on these are the tabs that you can get pretty powerful. So we could have a dialing rule that'll match a certain number and maybe disallow sending. So in our case, we don't allow international dialing. So this is one way to protect it. 011 is the international code. Plus means anything after it. And right under other, we say disallow. So you can block on numbers, and you could just block for a user. You can say if you can put a plus here in pattern, go to restriction and just match a user, only these users, and then you can block all their faxes, or you can only allow them to fax during certain time of days. You can adjust their numbers. There's a lot of interesting things you could do with dialing rules. That's basically a class within itself, but I just wanted to briefly go through all your dialing rules. Okay, the next feature I'd like to talk about is RightFax Delegates. Under the Tools, Delegates, under Fax Utility, you have the ability to assign delegate rights to other users to your fax box. So in this situation here, I'm logged in right now under Sam. As you can see, I have Sam highlighted in his all. So I have the ability as administrator to go into any user and assign delegate rights. So right now I made the administrator the delegate of Sam's fax box. What you do is you highlight the user on the left and you click the arrows and it moves them over to the current delegate field. At that point, the default is owner, which means they have full permissions to your fax box. You can then tighten up by using roles, maybe just make them a reviewer, or you can even do custom. So you might want to say, well, they can read my faxes, but I also want them to be able to rename folders. Let's move on to the RightFax services. If you look at the bottom right frame, you have all the RightFax services. Each one of these services corresponds to a Windows service. What's nice is you can do all your configuration directly from the Enterprise Fax Manager. For example, if you'd like to stop a service, you can right-click and click Stop. You can also configure a service, and you can start or stop all services. I find this a real time saver when there's a reason to stop all services, let's say a scheduled backup, and you want to do it right from the GUI. You can do a stop all instead of going into the Windows Services applet and individually stopping one service at a time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way down and go through all the services that are configurable. And the key is not all services are configurable. The ones that you can configure are the doc transport, the server module, the work servers, email gateway, e-transport, and if you're licensed and using it, the integration module. The ones I skip, such as RPC, QE paging, are not configurable. You can right-click on them and you notice there'll be no configure. It's grayed out. So let's start with the doc transport module. I'm going to right-click. You can also double-click to open the configuration. Let's give it a second. And the doc transport module is the service that controls either the board or, if you're running fax over IP, the SR140 software. Let's get right into it, and we're going to look at the global doc settings. Not much here at all. Global doc settings basically is for troubleshooting if you want to increase the event log level. All of RightFax services should have this, and by default it's always terse. For troubleshooting, we usually drop it down to verbose. What verbose does is it writes everything to the Windows event log. Great for troubleshooting. For example, if doc transport won't start or another service is having trouble, such as conversions or email gateways are not working, you can always put them in verbose, try to send some faxes through, and then check your Windows event log, and basically it's going to tell you step by step what it's doing. There is another option called debugging, a little more advanced. I'll quickly go through that towards the end, but I want to move on with this section. So from here we're going to go into the configure board server. Now this might look different than other people's setup because we have an older card in this test server here. We have a TrueFax, which is a legacy card. Most of you, if you're running RightFax 9.0 or greater, you probably don't even have the board server. You just have the doc transport, which looks a little bit like, well, I don't want to say like this. It actually looks like this, but you have the add transport. And you know what? Let me add a card just to show you. Let's go through this real quick. So let me add a 1034, which I imagine most of you out there have some form of 1034 card, be it a digital or analog. And I'll quickly go through the difference. So if you look down the list here, you have all your 1034 cards. It's a pretty easy naming convention. It's the model number plus P, which means a PCI interface. The 8, 16, 20, 24, these are all the channels. And then the last section after the channel number would be the kind of interface to telco. So we have our choices of E1, which is used in Europe, T1, which is a pure digital connection. Then you have the Ls, which are loop. Then you also have some Bs, which are BRIs, again used in Europe. And then you should also have towards the bottom Cs and Ds. A C is a combo card, which means it's analog DID, which is a protocol used by a lot of the phone companies. It's an analog protocol that actually passes DID information. This can only be obtained from the phone company. You can't use this with your own PBX or anything, and it's something you have to order. You order what's called analog DID trunk lines. The key with analog DID is it's inbound only. That's why they make a combo card, because the D cards are analog DID. If you just put a 4D card in your server, you would only have inbound faxing. You'd have no way to send a fax. So they make these combo cards, which have this one would have 2 inbound analog DID and then 2 loop, which can be used for outbound and inbound, but remember, with the loop, you have no routing. It's a pure analog. And then this section here, which is the dash ends, one ends, are very similar to the ones up here, but these are the newer ones, which really aren't new anymore. They've been out for over 5 years. They have the network interface, which allows you to do fax over IP. So let me add a 16 or an 8. Let's do a 16, so it'll look a little familiar. And now, if we go in here, this is what most of you will see when you go into your dock transport. And there's some important settings here. One of the most important ones is a fax ID for all channels. This is that small writing that's on the top of every one of your outbound faxes. Most companies put a company name there. Some will put a fax number, but most cases a company name would be better suited because you have multiple lines and multiple inbound lines coming in. So it's usually, unless you have a generic fax number or a general fax number, you probably want to put something a little bit more general, like your company name. Or in some cases, as you can see, you can actually uncheck this and actually set it on an individual channel. So right here, fax ID, and you can actually, then through dialing rules, you can actually control that. So let's say you have a couple of companies within your company, some subdivisions, and you wanted to say the parent company on maybe channels 2 through 8. So you can put 2 through 8, you could put the parent company name here, and then 9 through 17, you might put a subdivision name here. And what you do is through dialing rules and groups, you could put everyone that's in that subdivision of that company in a group, and then limit them to these channels. So it's kind of neat. You can really get very granular. You could do it on an individual channel basis. You can do it on a user level basis. So there's a lot of control with that fax ID. Let's go back to that again. Sorry. Let's highlight the card. And some of the other things, board number. It's important because the 1034 series card, the individual cards have to have their own module number. So if you put 2 1034 cards in a server, so let's say you have a 4-channel analog and you expand and you want to add a second 4, maybe even a 2, the second card you'd have to set to channel 3. And it's not only here, but on the card there's a rotary switch on the top of the card that has to be changed. As I mentioned, the first card is always 2, and that's the default. The second card would be 3, and if you had room, you could even put a third, which would be 4, and you work your way up. Excuse me. Number of digits for routing. Again, this is used for any of the analog DID or digital cards. We're basically saying that even if the phone company is passing 7 digits or 10 digits, we're going to collect 4 for routing. And this is important because you need this number to match, let me cancel out, the 4-digit route code in the users. Let me just authenticate and show you. So this route code here, which we have some test users here, 50998, these are 4 digits, so it's important that we don't set that number to anything more or less, because then we won't, if we set it too low, we'll only collect 3 and it won't match any user, and all the faxes will get dumped to the administrator. If we make it too high, in theory, we won't even answer the call properly because we'll be waiting for the additional digits from the telco, and if they don't come, we'll just hang. So that's very important for troubleshooting. Let's go back to this and we'll continue on. I'm going to configure Brooktrap. I don't think anything's going to happen because, as I mentioned earlier, this card really isn't in the system, but I want to see how far it lets me go without the card. Let's see what happens. So this is going to bring up the Brooktrap configuration tool. This is some advanced stuff, and I'm not going to get into it too much during this class, but I just wanted to show you the interface, and let's just see what happens. We're probably going to get an error, and that's okay. Okay, here's the configure IP stack. So as I mentioned, these cards can handle fax over IP, either SIP, H323, or both. But in this case, we're going to say none. And I'm not going to get too much into fax over IP. We will be conducting some additional training, and we'll notify you on the dates on that really go into the fax over IP and how to configure that and some of the advantages. Okay, so I don't have the card here because at this interface, it really is the physical driver. So without the card being inserted into the server, it won't show up. The card would show up here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, basically we do have an SR140 interface here, and this is basically where you configure your fax over IP. But I do have an idea. Let's cancel out of here, and let's hit cancel, and let me go into my legacy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this does have a card. It's an older, what's called a TrueFax card, and it's right here. So this is similar to what you would see if you went into the TrueDoc transport. We're doing it from the legacy board server, but the interface will look very similar. So you'll have the DID settings here, not to be confused with the digits for routing. This is something we're doing with our test server where we actually collect DTMF digits. So we're collecting 4 digits off an analog card, and we're routing on 4, and it's pretty neat. So what's going on is, if you have a PBX that can actually pass DTMF tones out an analog port, you could actually do some DID routing without an analog DID or a T1 card. What happens is most people that have a PBX have some kind of PRIs or T1s that go into it. From there, through PBX programming, we can route a range of DIDs out the analog card with DTMF tones, and RightFax can then extract those DTMF tones, convert that to raw data, and then look up the user in the Enterprise Fax Manager and route based on those DTMF tones. So we're basically simulating a true DID. And it's nice. It has some limitations. There's some timing issues we've come across where some PBXs might send the DTMF tones too quick, and we miss one or don't get them. But in most cases, it's pretty accurate, and a lot of people are doing it. And the one big advantage over DTMF over analog compared to analog DID is these can be used two ways. So we have a 2-channel, and as you can see, they're both set up for both channels, both. Let's go right into it again here. Let's look at the channels, and this will be very similar even on a digital T1 line. You'll have your activate. Very important, if you only have, let's say in this case we only had a 1-channel license, it's very important that we deactivate this 2nd channel. If we left this activated but our RightFax license was only 1, RightFax would actually shut itself down. So here's where you deactivate a channel. And the reason I mention it is a lot of companies might have a 4-channel RightFax license, but they purchase an 8-channel analog or digital card. So it's important they go into this interface and deactivate the bottom 5, 6, 7, 8 channels so they're within their license. Other important things here are the maximum channels may send. Not really important, but just be careful for troubleshooting that this wasn't changed to 0 or something, because basically you would disable the channel. Here's that DTMF routing I talked about. Here's the timing and more granular, going down into how we're collecting DTMF. So we're basically saying that we're expecting 4 digits. We're going to wait 30 seconds to get the digits. We don't expect any kind of terminator at the end, so we don't expect a pound. It's just we're going to collect the raw 4 digits. Channel extension in an analog world can be important. This is where we do line routing. I'll give you an example. If I change this channel extension, here's a good one. So here's this channel extension is 2222. So what happens is any call that comes in to channel 0 is going to get a channel extension of 222 on an inbound call. Now if I cancel out of here and look at a user, what it's going to do is it's going to try to find a user that has 222 as its routing code in it. This user here, Barry, would then get all the faxes that come in on that line. So that's line routing. So the negatives on line routing is it's a 1-to-1 correspondence. So if you have 2 users and you have 2 fax lines, that's great, but in the real world you can have a lot more than 2 users. So a lot of times that's used for a company that might want to fax everything to a fax receptionist. So let's say they have a 4-channel RightFax system, they have 4 analog lines. What they can do is they can set the same channel extension to all 4 lines and then deliver. So they would put 222 on channel 0, 222 on channel 1, and if they had channel 2, 3, they would, same channel extension they would add. And any fax that comes into any one of those channels would be delivered to the same person. And that person can then look at the fax, and based on the cover sheet or the information on the fax, they could route it using the fax utility. And we spoke about routing earlier when we went through the fax utility. So that's called manual routing. So it's a combination of line routing on an analog card and then manual routing using the fax utility. Also the timed ability, it's pretty neat. What we could do here is based on the time of day, and this is an hour. So this 0 would equal midnight, and the default would be from midnight to 11:59 p.m. The capability is both. We could actually say, well, from midnight to, let's say, 6 a.m., 0600. Let's say during those periods, no one sends faxes. We just receive a lot. So we can actually change the capability of the channel to answer only. And then from 6:01, I don't think you need the 0, but I like the way it looks. So 06:01, military time, until, let's say, yeah, well, let's leave it, 11:59. We're going to go back to both, and then we could change it again a third time. I'm going to keep it simple. This is just 2. So basically, and if you look at this, I'm saying from midnight to 6 a.m., answer only, and then again from 6:01 to 11:59, we go back to both. So based on how your RightFax system is used, if you do blasts at night or vice versa, you receive a lot of faxes at night, you can change the capability automatically 3 times during a 24-hour period. All the services have this select service account, which can be very important. I recommend to use a true domain account with local admin privileges. It doesn't have to be a domain admin, but I like to use a domain, so that's our domain, ATNY, and then we have an account called ATI Services. You can set this up to be the local system, but there is limitations. First of all, if you haven't moved your SQL server off RightFax onto its own SQL, local system won't work. Local system has no access to the network. Everything is local. Everything has to run local if you're going to use local system. There are services, and I'll show you in a minute, that can run as a local system, and they should. There's no problem. But anything that either talks to the SQL, which is the doc transport, obviously the server and database, and their remoting service down here, should be a true domain account. Things that stay local, like the queue handler, RPC, those can run as local, and by default they do. Another important one is the work service. Those should always run as a true system account, because the work servers do a lot of things. They do printing, they do file routing, they do network messaging. Anytime you see the word network, they deliver faxes to the network. So they need network capabilities. So the bottom line is, sure, you can run everything as a local system, but you're really limiting your RightFax to a standalone. It's really not a network system anymore, because you're not letting it do anything on the network, from printing to delivering faxes to email integration. So let's work our way down. So we went through the doc transport and board server module. Let's go into the server module. Now this time I right-clicked. I double-clicked. I could have right-clicked and configured, but there's multiple ways to open this. Most important one in the server configuration is the retry settings. By default, it's 5 count with a 5-minute interval, which is default. I think that's the default on most fax machines. I don't know if I went into it earlier, but I wanted to show you this question mark is very helpful, and it works, I would think, like 95% of the time. If you click in any one of the areas that you want to look at and you want additional information, you can click the question mark and get additional information. So you can see that field specifies the number of times an outgoing fax transmission will be attempted after it encounters a non-fatal error. So what it's saying basically is a busy, no answer, a human answer, those are all considered non-fatal. So it's going to try again, and then if we click here, it's going to tell us the delay in minutes. So that's the key. So it's 5 times with a 5-minute interval, and this can be adjusted. Be very careful. I've had customers increase that count to be very, very high. Like say they made it 30, and they said to me, well, Jeff, there's no problem. I really want my fax to go through. And there's a couple of problems. First of all, when you're sending it to a human answered, Do you really want to call someone 30 times before it gives up? Probably not a good idea. And you're going to have some very upset people on the other end. And also, I think history of faxing tells us that if you're not getting through by the fifth time, it's basically almost a half hour. It's 5 times 5 is 25 minutes. You're probably not going to get through it all. Maybe it's the wrong number. Maybe it's a no answer, and it'll just stay no answer. So I would leave this not much more than 5. You could tweak it a bit, maybe 7, maybe lower the interval. But 5 and 5 is pretty generic and pretty good. Some new features that if you have 9.4, which I think are pretty neat, is auto-delete failed gateway faxes. What this is saying is when a fax is gets delivered into an email gateway, if it can't for some reason, because maybe the gateway is down or there's a problem, we're going to delete them. We're not going to leave them piled up. This leaves a bunch of temp files in some of your gateway folders, so it's a good way of keeping your gateway interface clean. Another one they added with 9.4 is disable routing of faxes with errors. The problem was when you got a fax, let's say an inbound fax, and on the third page it had a problem. The old version of RightFax, if you didn't have, and you didn't have this, but if you don't check this, will actually deliver the errored fax. And you might say, well, that's okay, at least I'm getting something. The problem is the remote fax machine knows it's an error and it's going to send it again. So then you're going to get a second fax, and hopefully that one would be complete. So now you have the errored fax and the complete fax in your email. So this basically just knows that if it's an error, it's going to get tried again, so it doesn't even deliver it into email. Create new user when printing to the fax queue is pretty self-explanatory. It's saying if you're using the RightFax printer, it's going to create a new user in RightFax based on the user ID from the person sending it from the fax printer. So I'm at my desk and I send using Word, and someone installed the fax printer on my desktop, and I'm logged in as, let's say, Jeff K. It's actually going to create a user called Jeff K in RightFax. This could be a security hole, so be careful. You might not want to check this because there may be a reason why they're not in the Enterprise Fax Manager. You don't want them to send a fax. So if you uncheck this, they will get an error when they try to send it through the fax queue using the printer. All right, above the create new user when printing to the fax queue is the enable quick headers. When you check this, what it does is it adds a second line to the TTI line, which is on the top of every fax that goes out. So if we do a little help on this, you could see we can customize it and add additional information to the top of every outbound fax. And that can be customized with a total page count, the fax ID of the sender, the date and time, page numbers. It's all in the admin guide how to customize this, but you might use this if you have a customer that needs that additional information for their workflow. Above that, we have the enable CSID routing. When this is checked, we can route faxes based on the programming of the remote sending fax. So basically, if you could control that, let's say your customers are a group of users that you can control how they program their fax machines. Say you had a group, you were in medical industry, and let's say you were getting information from a bunch of your pharmacists, and you could tell them, please program your fax number, your fax machines with your fax number. Once you have that information, you could set up a CSID routing list, and you can route based on that information. So if you didn't have digital lines or you didn't have DID, analog DID, you can still do routing based on CSID. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, you really need to have control over the sending fax machines. And we definitely have customers using this, and it does work, and it's a reliable method for routing, but you have to have that control of the sending, because if you don't, you have no idea how people are going to program their fax machines and fax service. You might have a company name, you might have blank, which is nothing, you might have just a bunch of digits, you could have anything. So it's very hard to use unless you have control of that. On the right side here we have our notification, and this is basically what it says. When allow notification is checked, we will allow notification of inbound faxes and outbound failures and successes to be sent. If there was a reason why you wanted to block this, and this was back in the days where we didn't do much email integration, we were doing more network broadcasts. A lot of times we wouldn't want this checked, but nowadays most customers do use some kind of email notification, and I can't really think of any reason why you wouldn't want to keep that checked. The admin once only is basically for group administrators and high-level RightFax administrators. It says when faxes aren't printed or where fax hasn't been viewed, and that's under the permissions. So if you had an administrator or a bunch of administrators and they said, I only want to be notified once, I don't want to know over and over again. And I think it's going to notify you, as this says, every 60 minutes. I'm pretty sure that's in minutes. Let's be sure. Time in minutes, as so will notify your user group's administrator of unviewed faxes. So basically every hour it's going to send you an email. You probably only want to know once, at least I would think so, especially if you're doing email integration, because in the old days, again, with network broadcasts, it might be a reminder. Every hour you get a pop-up saying, you know, someone didn't view it. But an email, it's once it's sent, you don't want multiple copies. So I usually check it mid-once only also. Down here, as I mentioned, this is how often it'll notify you at every hour, and this is the first notification time. So let's look at that. So user notification time is the number of time in minutes. It is how long it's going to notify a user for before it notifies the admin. So this is saying if in 1 hour a user doesn't print or view a fax, or there's any kind of error or message that needs to go to a user and they don't act on it, like they don't open it in Fax Utility or print it or do something with it, it's going to then notify the administrator. Let's go to Advanced. Under Advanced, there's not much you're going to touch. A lot of this is more advanced settings. The only thing I would ever play around with here is the event log. As I mentioned it earlier, you can actually put this under verbose just to get some more writing to the Windows event log for troubleshooting. The threads and the I/O threads here are more for tweaking the system. In case you have a pretty robust RightFax server or high-end RightFax server with plenty of channels, you can increase your threads and your I/O threads. And you don't want to do this without really making sure you're having issues or problems, because increasing these threads and I/O threads, are going to increase CPU and memory usage. It's also going to increase your I/O out to SQL. So it can increase your network traffic, and it's going to hit your SQL server harder. So if you're having performance issues with RightFax, I would notify your support desk or the RightFax support desk, and they can help work on this and decide if this needs to be raised or sometimes even lowered. Maintenance cycle here, this is basically when RightFax is doing its cleanup. If you auto-delete faxes, which I showed you earlier under the groups, it's saying at 2 a.m. is when it's actually going to delete the images associated with the pointers in the SQL database. So although you might have a fax deleted earlier in the day, like by hand, like from the Fax Utility, you might even highlight a fax and delete. The image actually will stay there till 2 a.m. At 2 a.m. it's going to clean itself up and do other maintenance, some behind-the-scenes maintenance, clean up orphans and other stuff that it needs to do. And I recommend you set this to a time when the fax server is least busy. So the default is 2 a.m. and that can be moved later on in the day till 4 a.m., 5 a.m., whatever you feel is necessary. I'm going to skip some of the other things here. This is stuff you're not really going to touch, and I would go over this on a more advanced training seminar. So we'll move on to the feature activation. With 9.4 now, the feature activation is done through the product license utility, and basically all this is a shortcut that brings you the product license utility, which I'm going to bring up now. And this will show you your license. So if you ever needed to add channels or add a module to RightFax, this is where you would check, and this is where you actually do it. So I like to look under the product features here, and this will tell you your current licensing, how many channels you have, what modules are licensed, if there's an expiration date, if it's an eval issue, eval edition, and you can always go through this on your own. And if you ever needed to add channels, here's where you'd click activate, and then you would actually put in your SWID, your email address, you click your activate, and that would take you out to the OpenText activation servers. And if you are entitled to your upgrade, in other words, you purchased channels or you purchased a module, they'll know about it over at OpenText, and it'll give you a new license. Everything, other tabs here I'm going to skip. These are for more advanced features, and customization, which is for more advanced class. The data sharing, I'll briefly go into. This is used for putting RightFax in what's called a collective, where you have multiple fax servers sharing one SQL database. When you do that, you do need a central location for your images, your signatures, papers, cover sheets, and this is the shared location. This also has another feature. If you have a single server RightFax, you can use this tab to change the path of your images. We get calls occasionally from customers that are running low on disk space for their image folder because of the amount of size it uses. Here is where you would actually change it. So even if you're not licensed for a collective and you have a single server RightFax, you'd go right here and you could change this to another location, maybe a NAS on your network, a SAN, or just a different drive letter. Let's say your E drive was filling up and you did have an F drive or some kind of external drive that you plugged in and you wanted to move your images there, you can do it right here. So what you have to do is change the image path, and then obviously you'd have to also copy the images that are in the current location to the new location. You would hit OK, and that would reset everything to point to the new location. You know what, before I close it, I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think we covered the server configuration pretty thorough. eTransport, you might want to put an SMTP host here. This is used for when you're sending an email from RightFax. I don't know if any of you know it, but from the fax utility, you can actually change where you put a fax number. You could put a valid email address, and if you do have an SMTP host name here, that's valid. And the other key is all your users need to have a valid return email address, and I'll show you where that goes. So if we look at myself here, this email address needs to be filled out. If it's not, it'll complain and it won't work. If this is filled out and you haven't the right SMTP server in the eTransport tab, you can actually send an email from fax utility. So you'd put an email address where you put a fax number, and what it would do is it would convert whatever you attached to a TIFF image and then attach it as an email. All right, we're going to move down the list here, and there is nothing to configure under the database module. If you do click on it, it actually just brings you to the advanced tab under the server configuration, and we just went through this. RPC, queue, and paging, there is nothing to configure. If you right click, you'll notice config is grayed out, so that means there's nothing to configure. Let's move on to the work service. Now the work servers in RightFax, they're the services and the threads within them that basically do things, putting it very loosely. They do things. In other words, work server 1 here is responsible for creating cover sheets, library attachments and other kind of conversions for CVLs, overlays, PCL5 conversion, pure printing, deleting, and PostScript. And again, the question mark, great thing to do here, will tell you everything. So that explains what each service under the work server does. Out of the box, RightFax is configured with 3 work servers, work server 1, 2, and 3. Work server 1 and 2 are configured the same way, and in this configuration, as you can see, it is. I did add PostScript because we are licensed for the PDF module. If you did purchase a PDF module, you need to choose at least one work server to do PostScript/PDF conversions. Although it only says PostScript, you'll see it actually says require PDF. So I would highly recommend, if you have the PDF module, you pick a work server and you highlight PostScript. I usually actually do work server 3 because work server 3, as you can see, is not doing as much as work server 1 and 2. So usually what I do with work server 3 is I highlight PostScript and have that do it. In this configuration here, we actually have a 4th work server that we added, and let's see what we're doing here. Just for file routing. Here's a perfect example how you tweak your work service. If you had a pretty robust or large RightFax implementation, when I say that I mean usually a T1 or greater, let's say 24 channels or greater, and you're doing a specific thing with your faxes. An example, printing all your faxes, maybe routing them all to a network folder, anything that you're really intensive on, like where every fax that comes in gets printed, I would recommend you add a 4th work server and highlight printing. So you're basically dedicating this work server just for printing. As I mentioned earlier, anytime you tweak RightFax, you have to be careful, because what happens is when you add a work server, you're increasing memory usage and CPU usage. Now, adding a 4th work server and just highlighting printing is not going to really hurt you that much. I think it'll probably add another 35 meg of RAM usage and a very, very slight CPU usage. But what you're doing is now you're dedicating a work server purely for printing. So what might happen is you have a full T1 of faxes coming in. Let's say you have 20 faxes coming in at the same time, and the work servers are going to get blasted now with print requests, because you'll have 23 print requests. So you might get calls from your users saying, I'm getting the fax into fax utility quick and even into email, but I noticed the print takes a few minutes and they're anxious. You can add that work server dedicated for print, and that should increase your print speeds, because now you're adding a thread or internal service just for printing. Other things from the work server is your event log level. As I mentioned, you can increase that. Your telephone server, I'm not going to go into. That's a totally different. That's for using a a product called Call Express, which works with RightFax. Let's see, anything else interesting here? And then on the printer configurations, here's where you will enable a time stamp to every fax. Some customers do use this, so now if you're using auto print or any kind of printing functions within RightFax, anytime you print a fax, it'll actually add a customized time strip, And as you can see, the variables are all listed here, so you can customize it. Here's an example. So putting fax ~123 on the top of every printed fax will do this. Fax received, : there's the ~1, ~2, ~3. So ~1 is a sent receive, which is right here. So it's a fax and the word received for ~1. And then ~2 is the time, or the date, excuse me, and ~3 must be the time. Let's see. Yep, the time, and that's how you can customize it. Kofax, NetScan, and PeopleSoft, these are external applications that integrate with RightFax. That's it for the work servers. We're going to move on, and let's move down to the email gateway module. Some interesting things under here. This is your email gateway. Now, in this email gateway, we have the Exchange module. Let me show you some of the other things. You actually can add a group-wise, which isn't used much anymore. Exchange is also Notes and SMTP POP3. SMTP POP3 is basically used for integration with a pure SMTP server. As long as port 25 is open, we can deliver the fax into that server. Now, when I say deliver the fax, it could be the fax as a PDF or the fax as a TIFF, and it also can be notifications. So if we don't have an Exchange module, we can have an inbound fax come in, it hits the fax utility. If your gateway type is set to SMTP on the user level, and your type of the format type is set to PDF, you would actually deliver a PDF document right into the email address that's in the routing info field in Enterprise Fax Manager. We'll also deliver notifications into SMTP, so when you send a fax and it failed, you'll get your failure notice, or if you send and it was successfully sent, you'll get the successfully sent notification. We can also do POP. The way POP works in RightFax is if you wanted to send faxes directly from MS Outlook, we can actually have a fax being sent from Outlook using a format, which is, there's a couple of formats actually called, the SMTP POP3 format. The simplest format would be fax number at, and then a specialized domain name that you would use for RightFax. I'll give you an example. In my environment, it might be fax number at ATNY, which is my domain, and then I'll put .rightfax.com. And if I set up my DNS properly, it would route it right into a pop box. So what happens is from Outlook, I'm hitting send. I'm creating a fax, obviously, in Outlook, which might be an attachment or just a quick letter. I put in the fax number at atny.rightfax.com. DNS will then deliver it right into a pop box, a box on my Exchange server or any POP-enabled mail server. It will deliver that message there, and it'll wait there. Now what I'm saying is every 45 seconds, RightFax is going to pop that message off the server and deliver it, and that's why we have a POP3 mailbox name. So it would deliver it to RFax, and I didn't mention that. I wanted to mention if you set up what's called a domain delivery, you have to set a catch-all mailbox. So if you send it to atny.rightfax.com, I have to say anything that comes into that domain, basically called atny.rightfax.com, everything gets sent to this POP3 mailbox called RFax. And this is the password. So RightFax every 45 seconds is going to check this mailbox for mail, basically. It's a mailbox, but it has faxing information. It's going to pop that data off the mail server and then deliver it. It's a little, I don't want to say kludgy, but it's a little convoluted how you have to do it. Most customers, if they're going to do a lot of outbound faxing from email, they would use the pure Exchange gateway. And let's talk about that. And in the Exchange gateway, you'll see a lot of the fields below are similar, like include fax with notification, send through default, I think is there too. There's a couple of things that are the same. So let's go through the Exchange integration. That's a little different. How that's done is we're basically going to poll a mail server for this folder called RFax Gate, and underneath RFax Gate are in and out folders. So if I look at this and I copy this, I should be able to go run, there they are. So I'll see my gateway, and there's my in and out folder. So what happens is, if someone is set up for MS Exchange for their routing type, now let's talk about inbound. What happens is when a fax comes in, it's going to deliver the fax and or the notification to the in folder under this RFax gate folder, and there's a connector running on the Exchange server that is polling this, and it's going to pull it into the Exchange environment and deliver it. It's a little more than that, but I really don't have time to go through an entire Exchange integration. That could be a 2-hour, 4-hour class on its own. But I wanted to go through the basic troubleshooting. So here's where you're going to look if you're having trouble getting notifications. What I would do is I would have faxes come in, and I would look in this in folder and see if things are showing up here. You should see TMP files, and as they show up, the other thing you want to check is your pulse file should always have the date and time to be within 1 minute of the current date and time. Because if it's not, it means RightFax is not updating this pulse file, which usually means there's some security problem getting to this share. Out, similar but the reverse. You have outbound faxes sent from Outlook. So what happens is when you're sending a fax from Outlook, either using the Outlook button or the manual method in Outlook, those outbound faxes are dropped from the Exchange connector running on the Exchange side into this out folder. And under there you will have the server name. And under there, let's see if there's anything waiting to go out at all. Nope, everything's very clean on this system, but you'll have those files that need to be faxed. And the Exchange gateway running on RightFax is polling the out folder, and it's polling the server name, and it pulls that information or those temp files from this folder and then faxes them out based on the information in those temp files that are created from the gateway. Created from the connector on the Exchange side. Again, great for troubleshooting is have someone send a fax from Outlook and monitor this folder, and you should see something show up and then disappear. Let's say it shows up, but it doesn't disappear. That tells me that my gateway on the RightFax side probably isn't running properly, or there is, again, security issues. If it never shows up here at all, that tells me one of two things. Maybe my connector on Exchange isn't running properly, and I would start looking at the event logs on the Exchange server, or there's some security problem on Exchange. So the connector could be running, but there's some problem on delivering that outbound fax into this out ATMY fax1 folder. Some of the interesting things we could do with the checkboxes down here are, this is brand new with 9.4, which is include fax with notifications. This allows you to include a PDF or a TIFF and all pages or just the first page of the outbound fax with the notification. That's a great feature now, because now when you're sending a fax to someone, and let's say you send a lot of faxes, hundreds a day, as your notifications come back of the successes or failures, you will have like a snapshot of the fax that went out. So basically you'll get in Exchange, your fax has been successfully sent, and there'll be a TIFF or PDF attachment of the first page, or if you needed it, the entire page, the entire fax with that notification. So you'll be able to cross-reference what fax they're talking about. Process outbound email for this server only is used when you have multiple RightFax servers talking to an Exchange server, and they're basically checking the same folder. This will only process faxes, or emails again, that are sent from this server. So I don't know why they say email. I would think this would be more of a fax. I think they're saying email, but they mean fax from email. Let's take a look. Oh, no help. My luck, no help. But let me uncheck that. I'm pretty sure what this means is basically what happens is you have two fax servers for redundancy, and you have one Exchange server. So if you had a separate databases for each one, you'd want to make sure that if something was sent from fax server A, it's going to be processed from fax server A. But if it was sent from server B, if this wasn't checked, it can process it on A. So in other words, someone in Outlook sends a fax. Remember, I mentioned earlier that both servers are polling the outbound folders. And I guess that's why they say email, because it's a fax-bound email. So I guess you could say email here. So what happens is you have one Exchange server dropping faxes into that out folder. And if you remember when I did the start run, there was the server name under the out. And that's how it works. So what's saying is, if I had two fax servers here, maybe my other one was called ATMY Fax 2, anything that was destined for Fax 1 is going to show up here, anything that's destined for ATNY Fax 2 would show up in a folder called ATNY Fax 2, which would be created when you started the Exchange gateway on that second fax server. So now if this is checked, you're only going to process stuff in your own folder. So ATNY will only check ATNY Fax 1, and ATNY Fax 2 will only check ATNY Fax 2. If this isn't checked, you would load balance between them. You would check both. And there's reasons why. If you're in a collective, you definitely want to keep this checked because it's the same database and you want it to load balance. Or you don't want to check it, I apologize. If they're separate databases, you definitely want to check it because you'd have different databases on each server and you don't want it checking either one. You can have a problem. You really don't want faxes to go out on a server where the user doesn't exist because then it might create the new user or you might get a bounce back. So that's what that's for. This we saw earlier almost with the printer. It's just saying that if someone from email sends a fax and they don't have a matching RightFax account, use the default. You might want to check this if you want stuff to go, or for security reasons you might want to uncheck it. This is self-explanatory. This won't send anything out. PCL converter for text. It's just saying that when someone says a text attachment, wrap it with PCL. And this is only checked if this was running not on a RightFax server. You can actually run an email gateway on its own server. The default form is used for the advanced faxing functions you can do from Outlook with the Exchange gateway, which allows you to have the fax button. It puts in the real-time fax status. The frequency is saying every 45 seconds it's going to check those in and out folders. This can be tweaked, but you don't want to make it too low because it'll put, actually, see, it doesn't let you go lower than 30. So that's the lowest you can go, but there's a reason for that. You don't want to be checking your gateway every 5 seconds because it's going to put a lot of network traffic. And there's that event log level again for debugging. Okay, I'm going to cancel out of this and let's move down. We're not going to go through the integration module today. The integration module is a module you can purchase for automated faxing. It's basically almost a whole nother product. It's used for legacy faxing, faxing from AS400, from Unix box. It uses what's called FCL language to extract data from the data stream coming into RightFax, and we can automate faxing. If there's any interest in this module, please contact your support or your salesperson, and they'll make sure they get you the information. We went through the e-transport that was brought up earlier with the server module, and let's talk about the sync module. The Captera sync module, also known as Kappa sync. That is used for pulling in users from Active Directory. Relatively new. This was introduced back in 9.3, if I remember. Now, we used to have before that just basic Active Directory sync, and they redid this and made it the Captera sync module, and a lot more powerful. Now with this new module, not only can we pull in from Active Directory, and I'm going to go through it right here, we have a lot of control with these XSL files. So under the RightFax Kappa sync config folder are these XSL, and they give you some templates. They give you a default for Active Directory to generic Exchange. We can have one for 2007, one for 2003, and all it is mappings between RightFax and Active Directory. So what it is, it might have the user ID in Active Directory is mapped to the user ID in RightFax. The fax number in Active Directory is mapped to the default outbound fax number in RightFax, and it also has some code to pull in the last 4 digits of that fax number to pull in the DID routing digits directly from Active Directory. Other mappings from Active Directory are email address, voice number, user name, so your real name, which goes on the cover sheet, like the to name. There's city state. It's customizable, and it's in the admin guide, all the mappings. And if you're good with XSL, which is a form of XML, you can edit these, rename them, and define your own. The schedule basically says how often are we doing this synchronization. Most customers set it up maybe twice a day or every 4 hours. So if a user is created in Active Directory, within 4 hours they will get pulled into RightFax. And I also like to check this. So what happens is a user gets created early in the morning, and for some reason they need to use RightFax right away. We can force them to be pulled into RightFax just by opening and closing this applet from the Enterprise Fax Manager, or even starting and stopping the service. So you won't have to wait the 4 hours. The source and directory, these are just container names. So when I set up my mappings, as you can see, if I move this down, I created one called ATNY Biz. I could have called it anything I want. I could have called it Jeff. I could have called it ATNY. Same thing with the destination. These are just containers. So there's a source container, a destination. And once I define that, it creates these tabs above. So now if I go into my AD, ATNY Biz, here's where I can do my filtering. So what I'm saying here is I want to pull in from the atny.biz domain, and now I'm filtering just on this OU. So I'm just pulling in users. And I can browse and I can do it by any OU I want, or I can do it by group. So I might have a group called fax users in Active Directory, and I could filter just on those users. So if I have a domain with 30,000 users, but I only want to give RightFax to 1,000, I can create a AD group, put those 1,000 users in that AD group, and let's say I called it fax users. It would then go down your domain and go through all 30,000 users, but only pull in the 1,000 users that are in this group. And exclude a group is basically the opposite. Anyone in this group will not get pulled in. And the last tab is basically just your connection, because you can actually have AD Sync set up on one server and you can use it to talk to another server. So here's what the important one here really is, this account. You can see I say use NT authentication, so let's follow it down. I'm using NT authentication, which means for the service account. This one means use a RightFax again. I usually do this. I set up NT authentication. I then check my service account, and I make sure. In this case, we're not even using it. If you noticed earlier, it was disabled. But if this was enabled, I would use this account here, and I would put in my service account that's running my services. If I go back to my work service, that's the easiest way to find out, and I click service account. I would make sure that ATI services is running that Kappa Sync module, and then what I have to do is I have to make sure that ATI services is in my user list, and it's not, so it wouldn't work. I have to make sure it's in my user list. It is in sync with my NT account, so let's choose someone that would be like here. So I'd make sure this is checked. So user ID would be ATI services. I'd make sure it is integrated with NT security because it needs domain access. And then I would go to permission and make sure that administrative access is checked. So those are requirements. A domain user who's the service, so it has to be a local admin, so a domain user with local admin privileges, which is a requirement for a RightFax service. Make sure it's in the RightFax database, make sure it is an administrator, and make sure the Kappa Sync module is running as that service. If those requirements are met and you set up your containers and you set up your XSL file properly, you should have no problem pulling in users from AD. I'm going to move on to maintenance and backup procedures for RightFax. Let's talk about backing up RightFax. To back up RightFax, the key really would be to back up the entire RightFax folder. Let's give it a second to refresh. There it is. The easiest way is to back up this entire folder here. At minimal, if you didn't want to back up the entire folder, you would at least need to back up the image folder, FCS folder, and if you're using signatures, the signature folder. If you're using overlays, I would back up papers. I'd back up outgoing. This is where outgoing faxes that are being worked on. So if they're in the midst of being worked on and they didn't go out yet, you probably want to have that in your backup. And did I miss anything? I think that's the basics. But as I earlier said, I would just back up the entire folder. There's no reason why you would have any lock files or problems. And if you do, anything that's locked can be skipped. The raw data that you're going to be locking up that I just mentioned, like the images, papers, cover sheets, should all be easily backed up, even without an open file option for your backup program. And then the next thing that's very important is your SQL database. And that doesn't matter if it's SQL Express for the smaller installs or the full version of SQL. It's very important to have that rightfax.mdb and rightfax_log.ldf file backed up. That's what RightFax creates when you install it, and it creates that shell database, the shell of the database, and as you're using it, it's populating that with pointers of faxes, your users, your groups, your dialing rules. The other thing that's good to back up, it makes it easier, is the system state, which backs up the registry. Because if you do not back that up and you have a disaster and you lose your RightFax server and you reinstall RightFax and then restore your images, your folders that are important, as I mentioned, like your papers, your cover sheets, and your database, you're still going to have to reconfigure your boards and some other minor things, like if you have the integration module, that is in the registry. So it's not catastrophic if you do not back up the registry, but you just have a little bit more configuration. I would say at minimal, you might want to take a screenshot of your board configuration, because that shouldn't change much at all, and put that away. So then if you're not backing up the registry, at least you can do your restore of RightFax, and that goes into restore, so I'll talk about that right now. So to restore RightFax is pretty straightforward. You would install the base product. We'll assume you're at 9.4. You would apply any feature pack and service releases that you were currently on when it crashed. Then at that point you can restore your RightFax folders, or if you backed up individual folders, your images, cover sheets, papers, signatures, and then do a restore of your RightFax database. And then you would have to reconfigure your board or your fax over IP drivers if you didn't back up the registry. Make sure that's reconfigured. And lastly is you'll have to go through the registry and change what's called server GUIDs. What happens is that when you reinstall a fresh copy of RightFax, you're going to get a new server GUID. What you're going to want to do is, under the registry, if you go to HK local machine, software, RightFax, there's 4 places actually. Cluster, and I'll show you. There's a cluster GUID. And that's important. If you're running a collective, you don't want to touch this, because you're going to have to redo each member of the collective. This is unique for each member of the collective, so this could stay. But what you'd have to change is under cluster, here, this field. Now you notice it's the same. If you're running a single server RightFax, then you do need to change this, because this is the same as here. Server GUID and the cluster GUID, you notice, are the same. But as I mentioned a minute ago, if you are running a true collective, be careful. If you change this all to the same ID, you're going to have some issues. So we're going to assume most of the users here have single server, which is probably not true, but let's keep it easy for now. So you change it 1 place, 2 places here, 3 places on the fax server. You'll see it towards the bottom of the list here. If I go down, it should say server GUID, and the 4th is under the doc transport. You'll see it again, and you notice that number always starts, in my case, as 6 AD, because you'll see under doc transport. There it is again. Now, where do you get this from? It's real easy. The easiest way to get it is when you go into SQL, you'll need the SQL Management Studio. You open up the RightFax database, open up your tables, and go to the dbo.dt configurations table. Under there, you'll see the server GUID for your new restored RightFax server. I would do a copy of that and paste it in these 4 areas. So now your server GUIDs match your database, and you should be able to bring up your RightFax server all restored. And once you're bored, and if you had the integration module was all configured, and actually your email gateway might have to be configured if you didn't back up the registry. A couple of minor things, but you should be just about ready to run. I'm going to minimize this, and we're going to talk about a little bit maintenance now on RightFax. A properly installed RightFax server on reliable hardware should pretty much run itself, but there is some basic maintenance we recommend. First thing is, we always recommend to monitor your work service. So if you go to work requests, what you want to see here is mostly zeros. It's okay that if you see numbers are high, let's say you have a lot of mail messages, MS mail messages, or mail routing, or file routing, that's okay. And when I say high, I don't mean 50,000. I mean if you have 100, even 200. If you have a large RightFax implementation and you just sent a fax blast, or you just received a lot of faxes, these numbers could creep up. The key is, if you hit refresh, you want to make sure these numbers are starting to work their way down, not just growing. What happens is, if these numbers are growing, it usually means something's not happening that should happen. An example, maybe your email gateway is down. So the work servers are throwing all these work requests in, and these numbers are growing, but there's no email gateway to send the fax or the notification. So this is great troubleshooting. So if you go into your fax server and you notice these numbers are really high, hit refresh a couple of times, and if you notice it's not going down at all, you have to start troubleshooting. Start looking at your event log, start looking at your services, start checking those in and out folders if it's email related. A lot of times I'll see these net messages. I don't know if you know it, but Windows 7, they don't even include this the messaging feature. I think it's called like Net Messenger in Windows, where you can do a network like blast, where you can actually have a pop-up come up. So we highly recommend against using this net message, which, you know what, it's the default. When you create a user and you don't use the the Active Sync module, the default notification is, if I go to group everyone, I know it's going to probably be changed, but the default is network broadcast, and I hope they change that. But right now, if you don't change that or do any kind of Kappa sync, which will change it for you on the user level, it's going to use this notification type, which is a network broadcast. A lot of customers turn that off on their servers, and even if it's not turned off on their servers, it's not turned on the workstations, so you're going to see a ton of these building up. So if you do notice these net messages building up, what I would do is go through the groups and then go through your users and make sure no one's set for network broadcast. Some other maintenance that I would definitely recommend is, I wouldn't really call it maintenance, but it's really troubleshooting. I'm going to combine troubleshooting and maintenance is in your dialing rules. I've seen bad dialing rules take down RightFax service. Never assume anything without testing. With your dialing rules, and I know I went through that earlier, you can always go to dialing plan and test everything. So for example, if you were trying to maybe save your users trouble and you hard-coded a 9 here for your dialing rules for every outbound fax, you might think that's a good thing. The problem is, earlier I showed you most of the time when we do a 9, we hard-coded that at the dock transport level. So now every fax that goes out will be going out with a 9.9. And if you didn't test it, you would bring your outbound faxing to a halt. Nothing will go out. So as I mentioned, that might be troubleshooting, but I call it maintenance too, because I like to just keep an eye on my dialing rules to make sure they're accurate. And occasionally I test them. Some other maintenance procedures before we go into some additional troubleshooting is your image folder. As I mentioned earlier, the key folders in RightFax are your image folder and your cover sheet folder. And let's look at that real quick again. Whoops, wrong server. Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to bring that up. So E, and my server it's E, and then you should have a RightFax here somewhere. Nope, I'm doing it again. Got a bad habit. Hold on. Okay, much better. Sorry about the slowdown here. Okay, I think we're back. So if I go to E, RightFax, and in most servers it would be E program files or C program files, but when we set this up we put it right at the base. Got to keep an eye on this image folder. RightFax is not a document repository system. It's not designed that. If you find that you're not archiving your faxes and keeping them forever, you're going to slowly but surely bring your RightFax system down to a halt, because Windows doesn't like to have one folder with millions of files. This is a relatively small system, and you can see I already have 616 meg of images, and this is a little 2-channel, basically almost a test server. So my recommendation is you set up your archiving to a level that's right for your company or for your use of RightFax. We have a lot of customers that are in the medical industry or the healthcare industry, and they need to keep things for 7 years or even indefinitely. If that's the case, then I highly recommend you invest in a archival software. And there's a bunch out there. OpenText makes one called Alchemy that basically has a connector for RightFax. It's a decent product purely for that purpose. If you want to use it just for archiving RightFax images, then what you could do is you could set your deletion or your retention policy to relatively low, let's say 7 days, to keep this folder nice and small, and you can have that Alchemy product pull the faxes directly from RightFax into its own database, which is designed for millions upon millions of images, and there's a front-end search engine that you can use to find metadata and faxes directly from the Alchemy product. There are other third-party document archival products we can use, or you can use, and if you're not sure, I would recommend you talk to your RightFax or Advantage salesperson. They can get you the right product that would suit your needs. Let's go back to the Enterprise Fax Manager. Other things you could look at for maintenance is your alerting and monitoring, which I showed you earlier, which you can so your alert and monitoring has the ability to monitor RightFax services, and RightFax features, I would say. I know I looked at this earlier, but I just wanted to show you quickly what I'm talking about. When I say services, I mean we can monitor the fax server, we can monitor the board servers, but we can also, within that, monitor certain statistics. So here's a perfect example of just monitoring the percent of disk space available on the drive. That's a nice one. So we could say if your image folder is running out of space, we could send you an alert. Other maintenance, really, that's it for maintenance. I mean, we talked about backup and restore. We talked about keeping an eye on your image folder, keeping an eye on work requests. Obviously, keep your server running healthy. No problem with antivirus. I would recommend you do not scan the image folder for antivirus. Other areas are probably okay. Keep your servers patched, no problem. If it's a pretty large Microsoft patch, it can't hurt reaching out to your support team or the Advantage support team or the OpenText support team to find out if there's any issues with that patch. There have been a couple in the past, not many, but one or two that have caused some issues with RightFax. It's same thing with SQL or any other external applications that integrate with RightFax, such as Exchange. Very rarely, if ever, has there been a SQL patch or an Exchange patch that breaks RightFax, but it's common sense. If you apply a patch on a Monday morning and right after that your faxing is not working, probably a good idea maybe uninstall that patch and see what happens. But very rarely will that be an issue. And other troubleshooting tricks, I would call it, I would do are, let's bring this up again, is from the Enterprise Fax Manager. I would keep an eye on your services. As you notice, when I click Fax Service, this gives me a general green, which tells me all my services are up and running. If I click here, I can actually look at my status of each service. This window I didn't talk about too much, but is great for troubleshooting. Will tell you in real time the percentage of space available for images. One thing I don't like about it is you can't resize it. You really have to, it's a little tricky. You got to slide these back and forth. But the important ones here are your disk space for image. Disk space for database could be important, but I have to warn you it's buggy. Since 9.4, a lot of times this will say 0. I've even seen it say minus 24 meg. It doesn't affect the running of your server, and I was told that SR3, which will be out in the next 3 to 4 weeks, should fix this. There's no guarantee, but as I mentioned, it doesn't affect production. It just affects what you see here. So if you're running a 9.4 server, or even some versions of 9.3, and this says 0, a very low number, but your SQL has no problem with disk space at all, you could ignore that. Your queues are important here, so this will tell you how many channels you have available, and this is what RightFax uses for load balancing between channels and remote board service. So these queues go up and down as channels go on and off hook. Each channel gets a value of 1 million. So you see how it's 2 million because I have a 2-channel server here. As a channel goes off hook, it drops by 1 million. So if you had 2 dock transports and you load balanced between them, and one had 8 channels, let's say they both had 8 channels, your queue depth or your queue availability depth would be 8 million when they're all on hook, and as they go off hook, they'll drop. And that's how it load balances. It says, okay, if one has 6 million and the other one has 8 million, I'm going to send the next fax to the 8 million, so that drops down to 7. And it tries to keep that availability depth equal for each board server or dock transport. Other troubleshooting, obviously, is this window, very important. If you're having problems with inbound not getting routed properly, send a fax in or ask someone to send a fax in and monitor this window. What you'll see is the fax go off hook. You'll see the routing code. You'll see the remote ID, the rate, and these are all great for troubleshooting. An example would be if faxes aren't routing properly, it could be a lot of things. It could be that they're coming in without a route code. Maybe the teleco is messed up and they're not passing DID digits. Maybe you're not configured properly to capture the proper routing codes. If you're getting a lot of failures on inbound or outbound, monitor when they fail. If you notice faxes are coming in and a good percentage of them, especially larger faxes or more complex faxes, are failing, a lot of times that points to line quality issue. So we're getting the connection, we're getting the handshake, but as the fax is going through, we're getting a lot of bit errors, and after a while the fax protocol will just drop the call and you'll get that famous phase B error. If you notice that's happening more than it should, and it'll happen occasionally, but if you're getting a large percentage of them, you should look at your analog or T1 integration and make sure the lines are clean. I mean, in the analog world, it's very easy. You can unplug it, plug a phone into it, make a couple of calls, and listen real careful. Do you hear any background static? Do you hear clicks? These are things that the human ear compensates for, but a fax doesn't. A fax will drop. So that's great troubleshooting. In a digital world, it's not as easy. What you usually have to do is call up your telco or talk to your PBX vendor or your PBX provider, see if they could run some kind of bit error rate test, also known as a BERT test, on the T's, making sure they're clean. Now, this is an invasive test, so usually it would have to be done after hours. And it should be done after hours and for a solid hour. And you should have clean. If you have any bit errors, it's going to drop. Faxes don't like errors. Unlike the human ear, which can compensate, faxes cannot. As I mentioned earlier, troubleshooting email gateways, usually security related or connector or gateway related. Make sure permissions don't change on any file shares set up. Make sure your services are not stripped down. I've had customers where we start RightFax services as a Windows account, and for some reason they took away the administrative privilege, and it loses the ability to do things it needs to do. Other things you could do for troubleshooting, I highly recommend checking the Windows event log. RightFax is very good at writing any problems to the Windows event log. Anything. If you're getting conversion errors, and I didn't go into it too much, but when your work servers are converting cover sheets, if you get an error about it can't convert a cover sheet, it'll write it to the event log, and it'll tell you why. Maybe Word got messed up. And again, I didn't go into all the troubleshooting on the work servers and cover sheets because I just don't have the time. And in the future, we are going to run additional training, more advanced level training, where I go into customizing cover sheets and customizing the work servers and your Kappa sync module and going into those XSL files. So I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to come to this RightFax training seminar we conducted today. Thanks again for everyone's time, and have a great day.